These days, many people are very cynical about Mount Everest. They think of piles of garbage, dead bodies left behind all over the mountain, and long lines waiting to get to the summit in the death zone. But back in the day, 100 years ago, when the 1924 British expedition was endeavoring to become the very first to put people on top of Mount Everest, Everest was considered impossible, one of the greatest challenges that man could ever endeavor to do. And in 1921, when looking for a suitable route to climb Mount Everest, the men were literally going off the map to unexplored places that were unknown to most of the world. Those expeditions, 1921, 1922, during the first actual attempt on Mount Everest, and in 1924, was filled with exceptional individuals. Two of those men included George Mallory and Sandy Irvine. They disappeared on June 8th, 1924. They were last seen on the summit ridge, headed toward the summit, when clouds came in and occluded the view of them, and they were never seen again until 1999, when the remains of George Mallory was found at 27,000 feet. Today, I have an interview with Mick Conefrey. He's the author of Fallen, George Mallory and the Tragic 1924 Expedition. It's an exceptional book. It came out on May 7th, 2024 in the United States. I have a conversation with Mick who goes into great detail about the myth, if you will, of George Mallory. He's remembered quite positively, but he was much more complicated than that. And Mick goes into wonderful detail talking about his research of the book, about Sandy Irvine, and the fateful day that they disappeared on June 8th in 1924. Mick interviewed me while he was doing research for the book. He was writing a prologue and a detailed chapter about the 1999 expedition. I was the high-altitude cameraman on that trip that discovered the body and remains of George Mallory by Conrad Anker on May 1st in 1999. Before the interview with Mick Conefrey, make sure you take a moment to subscribe and also check out our membership of the channel, where you'll have some special privileges for members only, if you will. Mick Conefrey is no ordinary author. He's an award-winning author and documentary filmmaker, and he created what is called the landmark BBC film, The Race for Everest, to mark the 60th anniversary of the first ascent. Some of his books include Everest 1922, Everest 1953, and The Ghosts of K2, which won a National Outdoor Book Award. He lives in England. And now to my interview with Mick Conefrey, author of Fallen, George Mallory and the Tragic 1924 Everest Expedition. Mick, thank you. Given your books that you've done in the past, some years ago when you came out with the 1922 book, and did you know that you were going to do the 24 book, like thinking, okay, I'm going to build up to it, or did it happen more organically?
Not at all. I told the publishers when I was trying to get the 1922 book commissioned, I said, look, listen, everybody writes about 24. There's nothing more to say. But nobody writes about 1922, which was true to an extent, that it was kind of a little bit overlooked, really. And so I did it, and I hadn't intended to do anything about Mallory. But I just felt it was unfinished, really. You know, I knew I only had enough time for the first book to take it to the end of 22. And I wanted to do that to kind of, honor that particular expedition. But I just felt there was so many loose ends, like what happened to these characters? Because really, there was a core of characters, General Bruce, Mallory, Norton, Somerville, Arthur Hinks at the RGS. There's a core of characters. What happened next? What's the end of the story? And there is very much a sense, really, that the three expeditions of the 1920s are a particular arc, and then it stops, and then it picks up again in the 1930s. So I just felt it was an unfinished business for me, really.
Your interest in the character of Mallory. Now I know, and there are so many other characters in it, but talking about his his sadness over the death of the seven porters in 1922, and I kind of wonder if we could use that as a jumping off point in, obviously it shouldn't have happened, but it did, or we always say any death in the mountain shouldn't have happened. In his character analysis, did you think that this is something that was indicative of his personality, kind of going out too fast, bringing people where maybe they shouldn't go, reckless in his drive to succeed and go where no man had ever gone?
I think that I mean, reckless is a strong word. I don't know if I'd go quite that far, but from his childhood, he was a risk taker, and from I start the book with him on the beach, climbing up a rock and saying, "Well, let's see what happens when the tide comes in." But his parents, who are watching him, say, "No, I don't think that's a good idea." And he has to be rescued. And his biographer, his first biography, David Pye, who was a friend of his, he said, he just couldn't get behind the wheel of a car without trying to overtake the car in front of it. So I think Mallory, part of his character was that he was a risk taker, and perhaps a little bit like maybe he had a bit of his Amagilda missing, the bit which said this is dangerous. So, and I think that, and interestingly, the kind of the big question really about Mallory and Irvine is why did he take Irvine? And the answer is sort of obvious. It's that because he thought he was the oxygen expert. But why did he take a risk on somebody who was such a novice, and a great athlete, but somebody who had hardly done any climbing? And part of Mallory's nature, and something which he was criticized for by his great friend Geoffrey Winthrop Young, was that he sometimes didn't seem to be able to calibrate other people really, and often, because when he got married, he wanted to take his wife to the Alps on a honeymoon, and some of their close friends from their circle had actually died on their honeymoon. And Geoffrey Winthrop Young said to him, "Look, I think this is not such a brilliant idea." So, although Ruth Mallory did do some climbing and a lot of walking with him, Winthrop Young told him, "Just don't do this." And I think that yes, and that's one of the I think there is a question of sort of Mallory's judgment, really. I mean, and that's a sort of on the one hand, you needed his drive. You needed somebody like him who wouldn't say no, and couldn't stop himself, if you like, to succeed on somewhere like Everest. But at the same time, the issue is that it always involved other people, and so. At the end of 1920, the same thing to an extent happened at the end of 1922 as happened at the end of 1924, which was that Mallory pushed for an extra unscheduled attempt, and it hadn't been. Most people in 1922 didn't think it was a good idea, and Mallory basically misjudged the snow conditions on going up to the North Col and died in an accident. But I mean, but that it could have happened to anyone. But it was him who was the person pushing for it, and suddenly he felt intensely guilty about it. And possibly there's a motivation for him in 1924 to have gone to Everest, because what makes 1924 interesting from his character's point of view is, to an extent, he didn't want to go. He was very conflicted about going. His friend again, Geoffrey Winthrop Young, who persuaded him to go in 1921, sort of said, "Look, Everest is a means towards an end. You will get famous from doing this. It's not just a mountaineering challenge. I know you've got other things you want to do with your life, so this will be worth it. It'll put you on the map." But by 1924, he'd sort of got the job he wanted. He was working in adult education for Cambridge University, moving to a city which he knew well, where a lot of his friends were close by, and he was moving into a new house. His family was growing, and my sense is he was one of those kind of men who wouldn't have changed a nappy or a diaper, as you say in the States, but would have really enjoyed getting on with children who could talk back to him. And so I think he had a lot to lose in 1924, and so it was a very agonizing decision for him whether to go or not. And to an extent, he kept on trying to get other people to say, don't go. He wanted the people who had employed him to say, no, you can't go. You've only just joined us. You didn't tell us you were doing this. He kind of wanted his wife to say, no, you can't go. But the trouble was that there was a lot of pressure for him to go. And indeed, he personally, there's lots of reasons why he wanted to go. He saw it as unfinished business. He saw Everest as something he owned to some extent. And he also felt responsibility for the other people on the team, so thinking that, I know I've been to Everest more than anybody else, so I'm going to make it safer for everybody else. So you had this kind of maelstrom of conflicting emotions going on, and ultimately the die was cast and he went. But you kind of sense the repeated incidents where he tells his friends say, he just wasn't keen on it. He goes to see Kathleen Scott, who is the widow of Robert Falcon Scott, and he's just, who died famously, obviously, in the Antarctic. He goes climbing with his friends, the Huxleys. They say, clearly they had a real bad foreboding about this, and so. But yet, on the other hand, I'll still finish. I know this is getting a bit of a long answer, but I think the kind of the crux, the other issue of this is that I think the debate has gone on for a long time as to whether Mallory reached the summit or not, and this is the only question. But there's another question, which is, did Mallory decide not to go for the summit? Did he have a moment of realization when on June the 8th that he got to a point on the North Ridge, got to the first or second step, thought, hang on a minute, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here with Irvine. The safest thing is for us to turn back or to go and investigate Norton's route. And then subsequently he falls to his death, and that was what Norton thought had happened. The books that I do, I try and make sure that there's, principally about what people thought at the time and what the archival evidence is. And certainly Norton said repeatedly that he'd had a lot of discussions with Mallory, that Mallory was very aware of the responsibility of being the leader, and that he wouldn't have taken undue risks, And then you've got kind of two ideas. You've got Norton's idea, which is that Mallory wouldn't have taken a risk, and then you've got Geoffrey Winthrop Young's famous phrase, he must have gone for the summit because Mallory was Mallory, So, and that's the kind of, that is the kind of crux of the issue. It's not simply about saying, did he get to the top or not? It's also about saying, did he actually at a certain point decide not to?
That is absolutely fantastic. Yeah, because that is the big debate that gets tossed around, the summit or not summit. And there are people out there who say, well, people always fall and die on their way down from the summit, which I don't really believe in. I mean, there are a lot of people who have, but clearly he was on his way down because of where his body was in relation to, if Odell's sighting was at least west of the first step. That's all we need to know, because Mallory's body was east of the first step. So that kind of gets us to the Odell thing. Where did Noel Odell see the two? If he saw them on that day, he changed his story many times and seemed not clear about where he saw them. But he, and his, at least emotionally, wanted to continue putting them on the summit. They made it. But I kind of get that. You just like, those are my heroes now because they're dead. But what do you think where he saw them?
I have no idea. I think that he did see them because he was adamant about that. And he was very observant, Odell, had very good eyesight, was a scientist, a geologist, was at top form. And so I think I believe that he saw them. And when other people came back and said, well, could you confuse them for the shape of some rocks, as it happened in 1933, he said, no, definitely not. And so I've no doubt that he saw them, but where precisely he saw them is much harder to gather, because, I think it's because in his first, it's all, well, I won't go over all the detail because that's all kind of on the record, but it's clear that the issue about, for example, how many rock steps there were, I don't think that that in the 1920s they really conceived of there being more than two rock steps. This idea, which came later on with, it was an English writer, Audrey Salkeld, who went to Everest with Tom Holzell, said, well, actually, there's a third step. And I think it makes much more sense from in his description that they were climbing the third step. But you don't really see references to that. And so there are only two rock steps. And Odell changes his mind, that and the other thing is, I think, which is important, that people should get the idea that I don't think there was any pressure on Odell to go either way, really. I think that Norton clearly thought, who was the acting leader of the expedition, he clearly thought that Mallory hadn't reached the summit, but he respected the disagreement. And he was perfectly willing to let Odell write the chapter on Mallory and Irvine's last climb. He was perfectly willing to let him write the first dispatch for the Times. So he didn't force him to say anything. So the idea sort of come about a little bit that Odell was put under a lot of pressure to say, no, they hadn't reached the summit, and and it wasn't the second step, it was the first step. I don't think that's how it was. I think he genuinely wasn't 100% sure. And I think that when in 1933 the next British expedition went there, and they all went up the North Ridge, and all said, look, it's just impossible to get up this second step. But by that time he'd already started saying, I'm not 100% sure. He calls it the Great Rock Step, I think, at one point, but I think he wasn't absolutely sure. And so the idea that that nobody else, in 1924, in 1922, in 1933, thought that it was possible to climb the second step. All of the other climbers who came and had a look at it, all of Mallory's peers, thought it was impossible to climb. Now, that doesn't mean it was impossible to climb, and obviously we know it isn't impossible to climb because it has been climbed. But you have to, just think about what his peers were thinking, and then you have to qualify that by saying, well, it's not simply a question of Mallory climbing it, but it's also him getting Irvine up this really difficult rock face. But the clincher for me was after talking to Conrad Anker and Dave Hahn, and it's this issue of where the body was found. That in the 20s, all the people who are saying that we think that Mallory did make it to the summit, David Pye and Geoffrey Winthrop Young, his great friends, they had this idea in their head of him dying on the summit. I think David Pye says this thing about he made one final push. And so nobody really thought it was conceivable that he could have gotten to the top and come down again. They all thought, well, look, it would have been do or die. And, he put so much into it. He just pushed himself. And Irvine was so up for it, they just pushed on. But the idea that they could have got up the second step, got to the summit, then got down the second step, and then got very close to their top camp, come quite a long way back down. That seems to me to be a really significant thing, because you have to not just say they got to the summit, you've got to say they got to the summit and almost got back. Now, nothing is inconceivable. If you look at Herman Bull getting to the top of Nanga Parbat, if you look at Compagnoni and Lacedelli getting to the top of K2 after their oxygen has run out, people do amazing things on mountains. If you look at Chris Bonington and Doug Scott, getting up the Ogre and coming down alive, nothing is impossible, and I guess that's what makes it great. But you have to talk about probability, and if you're saying, well, what was the clincher of what you all discovered in 1999? I think it's the very simple fact of where his body is, that all the little details might give you clues. I think the fact that he's got a rope on is really important as well, because there were some people who believe that he might have separated from Irvine. And I think that was a very significant thing. And I think the position of the body is very significant. But all the rest of it is just kind of details which are interesting and fascinating, but don't really answer this kind of central question,
Mick, well, real quick before I kind of wrap it up and tie it up in a little bow, had he chosen Noel Odell, would they have returned and gone back home to their families?
I think, but this is like totally in the land of hypothesis. But if Mallory had gone with Noel Odell without oxygen, I have to say, I think they would have stood a better chance because, you know, one of the things that I came across was that really, I mean, people talk about how much oxygen he had and could it have got him this high and how would it have affected his climbing rate and stuff. But the oxygen sets were very flawed. They were worse than the oxygen sets in 1922. Everybody knew this. Back in London, at the end of the expedition, they planned to have a commission of inquiry into what had gone wrong. Specifically, why did the bottles leak so badly? But in the end, they kind of tried to, they quietly decided to set up a committee to investigate it. But so I think that it was significantly flawed, and who knows? Again, it's possible that they picked the right 2 bottles or 4 bottles or 6 bottles, which were full. But equally, it's possible that the higher they got, the worse, the more leaky they became. And so yes, I think that with Noel Odell. But that being said, on the other hand, Odell hadn't performed well at the beginning. So and Mallory, I think, was a loyal kind of character, and he'd sort of brought Irvine along with him, and he'd talked to Irvine a lot, and so. But he was convinced it was the oxygen was the key. He was convinced it was the oxygen that would work, So
Yeah, right. Thank you. So Fallen, your book, what is a reader going to get when they pick this book up and dive in deeply? Are they going to learn about their own internal mysteries, or?
I hope that they're going to get a really good story. I have to, I lay my cards on the table. It is a well-researched story. I had very good access to the archives, spent a lot of time in them. I haven't covered the book in footnotes, but I think it is a well-researched. There are a couple of mistakes, but we're leaving those to one side. It's a very well-researched book, but I'm trying to write a story to engage you. When I started off writing these kind of narrative books, the person who really impressed me was Tom Wolfe, and that book about the Mercury program, The Right Stuff. I thought he had a fantastic way of getting inside of people's heads, finding these surprising details, keeping you engaged like a kind of novelist would, And that's kind of tough when you're writing a book, especially a non-fiction book, and you're writing to a deadline. But that's what I'm trying to do, is kind of tell them the facts that are correct, but in such a way that you sort of, it's a great journey. So you'll laugh, you'll cry. I hope you cry at the end. I'm very pleased with the last chapter. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll think, in the end, I'm not telling you what the truth is. As I say, we're in the land of probability. Mallory, for whom we know so much about, his last 5 or 6 days, we know virtually nothing about. So I'm not going to tell you what happened because we don't know. But I hope that you'll have an enjoyable trip reading it, and so be it.
In the description of the video, I'll provide a link where you can find the book. Do a kind deed, don't ask for anything in return. Make the world a better place, one step at a time. Peace be with you.